Hi, my name is Alex Sudris, co-founder of Bold Method, and tonight we're going to talk about forward slips. This is a maneuver that everybody's supposed to do at some point in time in the training, and most people do. It's a required part of the private pilot ACS check ride, but at the end of the day, it's probably de-emphasized. And part of that is because in modern aircraft, you really just don't use it all that much, but it is still an important maneuver, and it's a ton of fun. It can be a little bit daunting when you start doing it, and that's just because the control movements feel so different than how we're supposed to fly an airplane. But once you get used to a forward slip, it feels completely natural, and you actually end up finding quite a few uses for it. So first of all, I'm going to start out just by explaining with this airplane the difference between a forward slip and a side slip. In a forward slip, we're going to roll into a slip, an uncoordinated slip, with the wing low and the rudder pulling our nose in the other direction, and the aircraft's moving forward, so the direction of flight stays forward. That's different from a side slip, which we use in a crosswind, where we have crosswind coming from this direction, we roll into a slip, we keep the nose aligned with the runway with rudder, and we actually are slipping to the side, but when you combine that with a crosswind, the aircraft's going straight. So in both a forward slip and a side slip, both times the aircraft's moving straight. It's just that a forward slip's got the nose way over to the side, and its entire relative motion is straight. The side slip is the exact same maneuver, down to a little lesser degree, and it's countering crosswind, and you're using the rudder to keep the nose going right down the runway. So if you took away that crosswind, the side slip would end up going something like that. Okay, so why would you ever execute a forward slip? Well, first of all, a forward slip is a drag generating maneuver. The entire point is to increase the amount of drag coming off the airplane. And if you think about it, airplanes climb from excess thrust. Without getting into Vx and Vy and power curves, the more thrust or power you add to the airplane, the more it's going to climb. Well, of course, countering that excess thrust is drag. And so if we have our throttle at idle and we add drag, the airplane's going to start to descend faster. The best part about it is we don't have to increase our IAS, our indicated airspeed. We can descend using drag and keep our airspeed the same. So what are some uses? Well, first of all, if you're flying an original Piper Cub, they don't have flaps. Most early aircraft did not come with flaps. They weren't designed into airplanes yet. And so the only way to adjust that descent rate, besides reducing the throttle to idle, was to bring the aircraft into a forward slip. Nowadays, pretty much everybody has flaps on the airplane, but there's still some really, really good uses, and we'll take a look in detail, but one of which is if you lose your engine. If you lose your engine, you're making a power-off landing. You can increase your descent rate by adding flaps, but that's a fairly permanent decision. We'll see why. You can also temporarily increase your descent rate by entering a forward slip, okay? And then in mountainous terrain, we had a reader write in, and we sent out a questionnaire about this, and one of our followers said he's got a Turbo Saratoga, and he typically flies from Taos to Angel Fire. So I'll pull that up here on ForeFlight. And you can see Taos here right off on the side, and Angel Fire. And there's a pass here, comes through at about 9,000 feet. This mountain up here is about 10,500. Pattern altitude at Angel Fire is about 9,400. So really, when you come over the top of the ridge and into Angel Fire, you at least have a couple thousand feet to lose, if not more, over about 6 miles. And one of the issues you're going to find when you're trying to lose that altitude, especially in a high-performance airplane, you really don't want to do it with the throttle to idle, because the engine's going to get below the recommended CHT temperatures. So a forward slip is a great way to add drag, slip the aircraft down into traffic pattern altitude while keeping your indicated airspeed low. And this is something we'll even do in the SR-22. I've done it going into Aspen. One of the advantages, especially if it's cold, I can use a forward slip and keep my power in. There's nothing wrong with keeping power in a forward slip, even though we normally don't do it. The advantage with keeping some power in is I can keep my engine warm and I'm generating some drag, allowing the airplane to come down. So we'll take a look at some of these in detail, but first, let's actually take a look at a forward slip in place. So we're going to go to Steamboat, and I'm already lined up here. We're lined up for the runway, and I'm going to enter a forward slip with my left wing low. So I'll talk you through as it happens. And here we go. As I bring my aileron in, I'm rolling, and my rudder to the right. You'll see the runway off to the side, but my flight path stays straight. You can see I'm using the aileron on my downwing to keep that wing low. I'm going to pause it here for a second. One of the things you're going to notice, if you look at my airspeed, I'm about 83 knots, but I'm descending at about 1,300 feet a minute. And this is one of the advantages of a forward slip. My normal approach speed in the SR22 Turbo on final is between 80 and 85 knots. And I'm able to increase my descent rate without increasing my final approach speed. So when I roll out of this, I'm already set up for a landing. If I dump my nose, I'd be fast and I'd float. So we'll continue this all the way down to the runway. You can see I'm holding in the left, rolling left, right rudder. So left aileron, right rudder. And now I just re-coordinate the airplane gently. And the nose lines up right down the runway. And we touch down. Okay, so there's something I want to show you here as you watch what happened. I'm going to rewind just a little bit, and we're going to roll back out. I want you to watch my descent rate. Right now I'm going down at about 1,200 feet a minute, so I'm going to pause that. You can see, I'll circle it so you can see it. Right there, I want you to watch that change as I roll out of my forward slip. Immediately, even while keeping my nose down, my descent rate starts to decrease. And that's one of the advantages of a forward slip. If I tried to pull my flaps out to decrease my descent rate, I'd end up increasing my descent rate. We'll see that in action in just a little bit. But the beauty of a forward slip is as you re-coordinate that airplane, the descent rate immediately starts to go away. So it is the perfect temporary solution when you need to descend just a little bit faster. Okay, so everybody loves aerodynamics. We'll walk through the aerodynamics here so you understand what's going on. The aerodynamics of it is partially why it feels so uncomfortable when you roll into a forward slip, because it feels really, really unnatural. Your rudder and your aileron are totally uncoordinated. You're rolling runway and you're pushing rudder in the opposite, and it feels like something you shouldn't do. But it's an entirely normal maneuver. The more you do it, the better you get. So I'm going to load up an animation of that. Okay, and we're going to take a look at this from the rear of the airplane. So what you can see up here at the top, these are my controls. We have a side stick here. It's a Cirrus stick. You'll see that move. And then our rudder pedals. Okay, and you see we've highlighted our ailerons and our rudder. And then right here is our relative wind. So we're entering with the relative wind pointing straight down the airplane in perfectly coordinated flight. We're going to lower the left wing for this slip, and we're going to watch those control surfaces. So as I do that, I'm going to start to roll left. So you can see my stick's rolling left, that aileron's going up to bring that wing down, this aileron's going down, and I got my rudder swinging out to the right, giving me a force here that's pulling my tail left, my nose right. And now I'm fully established in the slip. Okay, so what you can see is the relative wind hasn't changed. It's still going like this, which means in a forward slip, my flight path is still perfectly straight. But what I'm doing is I'm holding in control pressure. I'm holding in left aileron, and I'm holding in right rudder. And I have to keep those applied throughout the entire maneuver. And what that's done is it's generated a massive amount of drag. And you can see all that turbulence coming off the right side of my fuselage. So what's happening is the relative wind is striking the fuselage here, and then this is generating form drag. So I'm increasing my drag profile. That's coming off the aircraft, and because I'm increasing my excess or my drag, I'm effectively decreasing my excess thrust or power, and the aircraft's descent rate's going to start to increase. Okay, so how do you recover? Simple enough, you just let go. So as I re-coordinate the airplane, you'll see that the airplane swings all the way back to straight and level. It naturally rolls itself level, and the fuselage aligns. And that's because if you take a look at what's going on here, first of all, the wind is hitting the fuselage, okay? And it's hitting that vertical stabilizer. So right there, as you bring that rudder back to neutral, it's gonna push the tail right back in line so it's lined up with the relative wind. You can also see a little bit from this image, we have a little bit of sweep back effect going on. The Cirrus has a slightly swept forward wing. And so if you kind of extend out the relative wind here, what's happening is this wing has more direct relative wind than this wing. There's a little bit of an angle here. So essentially there's more airflow over here. That's going to want to raise this wing. There's a little less airflow because the airflow is not going straight down the wing. It's kind of going sideways. And the only airflow that counts to generated lift is what we call spanwise airflow. So this wing feels like it's slower. And because of that, it naturally is going to roll back to level. So you can see here, we'll play it through. The airplane naturally rolls back to level. Now, one of the downsides, if you just let go of the controls right away, what's going to happen is the airplane's going to swing past. It's stable, but that stability is not perfect. So as opposed to lining right up with the relative wind, if you just let go of everything, it's going to swing through and you're going to kind of rock a little bit until it stabilizes. And since we're usually doing a forward slip down to a landing, we don't want to end up coming across the runway kind of fishtailing. So the key is just gently let the nose come back by releasing the rudder pressure, and gently let the airplane roll level by releasing the aileron pressure. But again, you're the one that's holding it in to the forward slip. To get it out, all you got to do is undo those control movements. Okay, looks like we got a question.
Okay, so we got our first question in here, and that is, should we do these forward slips when we have passengers on board?
I do. But, you know, that is something that really depends on your passengers' comfort with flying. And so when I fly with my dad, Colin, obviously he's a pilot, so he doesn't count. But someone who feels very comfortable with the airplane, I'll do it. I usually let them know because it does feel a little bit awkward. It's one of the reasons why if we take a side slip, a lot of people like to crab all the way down to the runway and then just roll out into the side slip. Again, it's more comfortable for passengers because you're sitting perfectly straight and level. A forward slip, both the pitch and the roll can feel a little bit awkward. But if you get them used to it, if they're very comfortable with airplanes and flying, no problem. But again, it's something that I would let them know that I'm going to do before I actually jump into it. Okay, let's take a look at what's going on from the front of the airplane. We got a forward view here too. So this is our front camera. Here we are, straight and level. Let's say we're descending slightly, coming down, and you're going to see the aircraft roll into the forward slip. That right there is our normal fuselage flat plate drag profile. Watch what happens as we start to slip. Boom. It increases. It almost looks to me like it doubles. So we have a lot more drag. Now, if you think about it, if you look at the descent part, you know, we're descending. So you got this relative wind coming like this. Notice that the angle here is greater. This angle is slightly smaller because this wing is tilted up. We call that dihedral effect. And that dihedral effect will actually push the aircraft right back up to level flight. So as we let go, dihedral effect is pushing us back up to level flight. And what you can see there, what we've got at the bottom, this guy right here, that's your normal fuselage drag profile. That's the profile with about a 15-degree slip. So you can see we can generate a lot of drag. And again, the easiest way to get it out is just to gently release those control inputs. So let's take a look at us doing this in Trinidad. Okay, so in this case, we're on base to final. You can see the runway right here, Trinidad, Colorado. And you'll notice that my flaps are up. So we're going to fly this as a no flap landing. And that's one of the things that we'll use slips for. If the aircraft's flaps have failed and you need to, your throttle's all the way at idle and you need to increase your descent rate, a forward slip's a great way to do that. So you're going to see us do this. And again, we're in the SR22 Turbo today. So our final approach speed's 90 to 95 knots. That's what I want to try to keep the aircraft at. So I'm going to use my elevator to control to keep me there. And you can see I roll right from a left turn into a forward slip to the left with the left wing down. I've got a little bit of up aileron in the left wing, keeping it down. And you can see I've got right rudder keeping that nose over. And you can see how quickly my descent rate's increasing, about 1,000 feet a minute right now. And I'm holding 95, my kind of planned approach speed. And as I re-coordinate the airplane and go to flare, you can see that descent rate stops and we touch right down. And so that's kind of the key. So let's talk about some limitations. Not every airplane is meant to slip with full or no flaps. A great example is the older 172. So if you look at the 172 with the 40-degree flap settings and you read the POH, you'll find that forward slips are prohibited with full flaps. And some of the later model ones, I think it's the P or the N model, they recommend that you don't slip the airplane with flaps in. So one's prohibited, one's not recommended. What's the deal? Okay, so let's take a look at a 172, its flap and its airflow. Okay. So here you have a 172. We have the flaps down to 40 degrees. So again, this isn't one of the later model 172s, it'd be one of the earlier model 172s. And with those 40 degrees of flaps, there could be a lot of airflow separation, turbulent air coming off the back here. And as we roll into a slip, what you're going to find is that airflow can start to blanket the horizontal stabilizer and the elevator. And in the 40-degree flap model of a 172, that can cause loss of pitch control. And of course, you're doing this at low altitude. All of a sudden, you don't have much pitch control until you recoordinate the aircraft. It can make it a dangerous maneuver. So in the 172, with full flaps, manufacturer says just don't slip it with full flaps. And in some of the later models, they recommend not slipping with flaps because you could get some buffeting as it hits that horizontal stabilizer or elevator, or you might get a little bit of sloppy controls. It's not dangerous enough to prohibit, but you might start to feel some adverse effects. Okay, looks like we got a question.
Okay, so I'm going to hop in here, Alex, and we had a question I think that really ties in well with what you're talking about right now, and that is, should we use full flaps with forward slips, or really, should you use any flaps with a slip like this?
Okay, so that depends on why you're slipping and the manufacturer's recommendations. So first of all, if you look at like a 172 with 40 degrees of flaps where it's prohibited, you shouldn't slip with full flaps. And if the manufacturer doesn't recommend it, I'd avoid it unless it's an emergency. Otherwise, you can slip, like in an SR-22 and a Cherokee, the Warrior I flew, you can slip with flaps full or no. So it really depends on the scenario. So a good example of where you may slip with full flaps is if you're making maybe a backcountry landing, or even some of Colorado's paved airports where you have really steep approaches. You might have the flaps down to full, but to plan a very steep approach, you can still roll the airplane into a forward slip. So something like an obstacle landing, and oftentimes, they're not even that short of a field, it's just that there's an obstacle on your way in. And so that's a case where you might want to flip or slip with full flaps. Okay, so how about without flaps? And I'm actually going to jump ahead to the emergency approach and landing. So in an emergency approach and landing, we all know to set up for a point if we can try to fly a standard traffic pattern. But as we add flaps to increase our descent rate, those are almost permanent changes. And here's why. Let's take a look at what happens as we add flaps. So I'm going to go to, wrong one. This flap retraction right here. We're outside of Trinidad, Colorado, and I'm just got my powered idle, and I'm going to bring my flaps down to full, and I'm transitioning from my best glide speed to about a final approach speed. Keep in mind, the best glide speed for your airplane doesn't apply when you have flaps full down. You have essentially a different wing at that point in time. So now I'm flying my appropriate speed for final, and I want you to watch my descent rate. Okay, so I'm about 1,500 feet a minute down. You can see it over here. And in a second, I'm going to pull those flaps up. Okay, maybe I'm not able to make my landing point. I want to try to regain some glide distance. So I'm going to go from full to 50. Now watch what happens to my descent rate. I gain an extra 500 feet a minute by pulling my flaps from full to 50. And now I'll go from 50 to 0. So you can see I regain my better descent rate, but it takes time. And that's me going from 50 to 0. Now I'm picking up about another 500 feet a minute, and then it'll slowly come out. So one of the problems that we have when we're executing an emergency approach to landing is that when you add flaps, if you need to take them back out, if you realize your descent profile is so steep that you can't make your point anymore, you're going to lose maybe 200-300 feet in the process of getting those flaps up. And if you're doing that on a base altitude, maybe 500-600 feet above the ground, you basically put yourself in an unrecoverable situation. Retracting the flaps at low altitude in an emergency approach to landing is going to leave you usually in a worse position than had you left them down. You're going to descend even more. Okay, so let's take a look. We'll jump back to that steamboat shot of us recovering from the forward slip. And I'm going to fast forward here just a little bit, and we'll go back just a little more. Okay, so if you look, I've got 1,250 feet a minute, and as I swing my nose back into line, you'll see that immediately start to decrease. And the same thing you can see in Trinidad. One of the advantages of a forward slip is as soon as you start to take it out, your descent rate is going to decrease. You're going to kind of decrease that descent angle. So in an emergency approach to landing, if you're not sure you need the flaps, you're like, man, I'm a little high, I'm just afraid to add these flaps because I'm afraid that I'm going to end up being way low, try using a little bit of a forward slip to make an adjustment and then bring the aircraft back to coordination and see how you're doing. Next question.
Okay, so we got a good one here that I think ties into the Trinidad landing, and that is, does wind direction determine which side you should point your nose in a forward slip?
Yes, and so if there's no wind or perfect headwind, you can slip in either direction. Typically, if I'm flying from the left seat, slipping to the left is a little bit easier in a no-wind situation because you have better visibility. If you're flying from the right seat, learning to become an instructor, slipping to the right gives you better visibility. But in a no-wind situation, really either way works pretty well. But when you're slipping with a crosswind, first of all, you're never going to use a pure forward slip. You're really combining the forward slip and the side slip. And as you roll out of that forward slip, you're going to transition right into a side slip. So I got an animation of that. We'll take a look at that in a second. But first, it's really important to keep in mind, they have two different names, a forward slip and a side slip. They are the exact same maneuver. It just depends how much rudder you're using and how much aileron you're using, and is the aircraft's flight path moving perfectly forward in a forward slip, or is it canted off to the side, countering that crosswind in a side slip. But essentially, they are the same maneuver. So let's take a look at that. Okay. So here we are. We're coming in on final, and I'm going to transition. You can see our crosswind is out of the left. And we're going to transition into a side slip. And so I'm going to bring this wing down. I'm going to bring the rudder, add right rudder, that'll swing my nose to the right, and then I'll be able to set up and go right into the side slip as I get up to the runway. So here we are in a forward slip. You can see us nose to the right, left wing down, but as we roll out, now we keep that left wing down. We just make little adjustments with the aileron and rudder to bring the nose right in line with the center line, and now we're still in a slip, but we've got a little bit of sideways motion that's countering out the wind. The rest of it is forward motion. And if you were to go back in this timeline here to where we're in the forward slip, we're really using a combination. We're using a forward slip and a side slip because we're still generating a little bit of side track to keep the airplane moving forward. So in a crosswind, you're always going to slip with the wing towards the wind because you're really doing a combination of the two slips. Okay. So that brings up a question also that people have, which is, what happens if I stall in a slip? Am I prone to spinning? You're uncoordinated, and you're oftentimes at low altitude in a slip. So the concept sounds a little bit dangerous. And of course, any sort of a stall, if left uncoordinated, can lead to a spin. But in a forward slip, the airplane is actually going to try to recover from the roll for you. It's going to roll itself back to level during a stall. And if you release your control inputs, it essentially will fly itself out of the slip and the stall all on its own. So let's take a look at that. Okay, so in this case, let me clear out our drawings. You can see we're in a forward slip, and you can see as we increase our angle of attack, this stall region, that's the red region here, it's progressing out along the wings. And what you're going to find, watch which wing ends up with more stall. You can see it's the high wing right here. This wing is stalled more than this wing. Okay, so why is it that? Well, there's a couple things. First of all, this wing right here is receiving more direct airflow. It's essentially getting more span-wise airflow right over the wing. That's generating lift. This one here, because of sweepback effect, this one has got a little bit more of an angle to it. And because of that, it feels like it's moving slower. So that's one issue. You can see this aileron is pointed down. So that's also raising the angle of attack of the wing. And so all of that is causing this wing to be more stalled. And as the aircraft enters a stall, you'll see immediately this wing, which has a higher angle of attack, drops, and it brings you back towards recovery. At the same time, your vertical stabilizer and the fuselage, they're pushed back by the relative wind, and the aircraft wants to line itself back up. Now, of course, if you left your control inputs in, if you held the aircraft in an uncoordinated scenario or situation, it could enter a spin, but the reality is if you let go during a forward slip, the aircraft will try to roll itself level, and it basically feels like a normal stall recovery. Okay, we got a question?
Okay, so Mark's got a question here that ties right into what you've been talking about, and that's stall risk. And I'm going to add just a little bit to this. When you're doing a forward slip like this, is it going to increase your stall speed? Is it significant? Is it not significant? Talk just a little bit about that.
Well, it probably will increase your stall speed just a little bit. You might have a little extra load factor on the airplane, depending on how much back pressure you have in at the same time. You definitely have one wing at a higher angle of attack. You're not really turning, but you might have a slightly higher load factor. So it could increase the stall speed, but I would say that that change is going to be very, very, very small. It's not an increase in stall speed like we would see if we're maneuvering in a turn, tight base to final turn. So really, you kind of trust your stall speeds are going to be right about as published. And so that's why in a forward slip, I'm typically going to fly the exact same speeds that I would use in coordinated flight. I don't want to get any slower. But if my final approach speed is 85 knots and I'm going to forward slip at 85 knots, the change in stall speed is going to be pretty minimal. And you know, one of the things you can do is go out with a flight instructor. Again, a forward slip's not an aerobatic maneuver. If you've never stalled the aircraft in a slip, go out with a flight instructor. They have. And see what that feels like. You'll see the aircraft rolls back to level. If you've never done it before, I would absolutely do that with an instructor. But you really start to see that the aircraft itself is very stable and it's going to recover from it or for you. And of course, you don't want to stall at low altitude because just that recovery can eat up a couple hundred feet. But you will find that it starts to roll the wings level. Okay. That is pretty much our entire rundown on forward slip. So, are there any questions?
I've got a couple questions queued up here, but first, before we hop into that, Alex, do you want to maybe run through the off-field, off-site landing and the slip that we used there?
Let's take a look at that. Okay, so again, one of the things that we talked about is in a forward slip, it's a great way to set yourself up if you're afraid to add flaps and slip down to the runway. So here we are, we're lining up. This is outside of Trinidad, Colorado. And you're going to see me roll into final approach here. The SR-22 drops pretty quickly with the flaps or with the engine out, so I'm not going to want to add any flaps until I know I have my landing field made. And if you look at this, what I want to do is land, I'm going to rewind back just a little bit. I want to land right here. You can see that little white road mark right there. I want to touch down right about there. There's a barrier here. And of course, in the SR-22, it's got a parachute. Normally, that's what we would use here. But if you don't have a parachute, you might have to make a landing off-field. And so I want to try to get the airplane to touch down here. But the problem is I don't want to put my flaps down because if I do that, I'm not quite sure I'm going to make it there. I may end up landing early. I just feel like I'm a little bit high. So what you can see is I'm going to roll into a slip, and I'm going to use just enough of a slip to keep that point right where it is. And actually, it'll probably stay right in position. I think we slip pretty perfectly. Yeah, you can see it's really not moving. So here I can use my forward slip to guide me in, and it's essentially keeping my flight path perfectly aimed for my desired touchdown point, and I don't have to add my flaps yet. Now, of course, this is a real off-field landing. I am going to bring flaps in as I know I have the field made because it's going to decrease my touchdown speed, but I don't want to bring them in early because if I bring them in early, I may never make that point. As you saw earlier, when we retract the flaps, at least in an SR22 Turbo, I'm going to pick up about another 500 foot a minute descent rate. You know, in the Cherokee, you see a pretty aggressive increase in descent. That does go away. It's just as the flaps are retracting and then you're changing your angle of attack. But the reality is you can lose a couple hundred feet in that maneuver. And when you do that, you're oftentimes worse off than you were before. So, looks like we got a question.
Okay, here's a question. This is kind of a check ride question, but it says here the FAA wants you to be fully configured before 500 feet. If you're flying a Cessna 172, should you be doing this maneuver without flaps?
Okay, so I would say that depends on the configuration and the limitations in your POH. So for example, if you're flying a 172 where it's got a full flap prohibition or it doesn't recommend doing it with 30 degrees of flaps, I would plan on flying the maneuver with flaps at 20 or flaps at 10. So, but you don't want to change configuration as you roll out of a slip for a normal landing. And that's because normally when you transition from that forward slip, you're going to do it really, really low. You're definitely right, below 500 feet, even lower, 200 to 300 feet. And the reality is, unless you need to slow your touchdown speed for an emergency landing, you really don't want to change anything below 500 feet. It's not just an FAA mandate. It's as soon as you start touching things that low, the aircraft is destabilized. And so your glide path to your touchdown point is going to destabilize. It's sometimes hard to hold the center line. So if you're doing this in your check ride, I would either plan to do it with partial flaps or, if you're in an airplane where there's no issue with doing it with full flaps, do it with full flaps, but kind of set your flaps up and then execute the forward slip. And keep in mind, the examiner is not expecting you to slip it all the way down to touchdown. What they want to see is that you can enter the coordinated slip, or the forward slip, that you can maintain the center line as the aircraft tracks down, and that you can roll the aircraft back out and transition to a landing. So you can, make that rollout where you feel comfortable. You don't have to wait until you're over the pavement. It's really up to you. Okay, next question.
Okay, got another good check ride question here, and that is, can I use a forward slip when I'm doing a power off 180 or an emergency procedure on my check ride?
Yes, the examiner probably will love that because it shows correlation. Again, one of the issues that I always teach with flaps is that flaps are, especially in a power off 180, they're essentially a permanent decision. You drop those flaps on base, they're staying in there. So unless you know you have the runway made, you definitely don't want to put those flaps in. And so by using a forward slip to make a small adjustment as you're on that final approach, if you know you're a little bit high, but you're not high enough to use flaps yet, forward slip's a great maneuver. It really comes down to a little bit of judgment. If you're very high, getting those flaps in's not an issue. If you know that with flaps, you're gonna make the runway, adding flaps, it's a perfect way to slow the airplane down because it does slow your touchdown speed. But if you're in a situation where you're not quite sure, if you put those flaps down, you may not make the touchdown point, a forward slip is a great way to make a short temporary adjustment, lose some altitude, you can roll the aircraft back level, and make sure that you've got the runway made. Okay, looks like that's all the time we've got tonight. Couple of things before we wrap up. Number one, if you like the videos here, our takeoffs and landings course, Mastering Takeoffs and Landings, full of 3 hours of video like this. We cover everything from upslope landings and partial flap landings. It's a great course, and we've got a link to it in the description. I highly suggest you check it out. It's risk-free. If you don't like it for any reason, we'll give you your money back. It's got a 30-day guarantee, so give it a shot. Number two, we've got our IFR procedures video coming up tonight. That starts at the top of the hour, and we're going to be talking about procedure turns. So if you're an instrument-rated pilot, we're going to look at limitations on them, distance, how to know where to measure the distance from, which fix, altitude limitations. We've got some great examples. And then number three, in 2 weeks, we'll be doing this VFR presentation again, and we want to know what topics you'd like to hear about. So there's a link in the description section where you can send in your ideas. We'll hope to follow up with you, and then we'll see you in a couple weeks. Good night.